Do you remember Shadowrun? I remember Shadowrun. This was around when I was a teenager back in the early '90s, and it had its bit of a loyal following. At the time, I've seen had friends who had copies of the book and all that kind of stuff. I had just got this one last week, and I mean, it seemed all right, but at the same time, I don't know, from my 15-year-old eyes, it seemed, maybe a little cheesy having D&D mashed with cyberpunk when you could either play D&D or you could either play cyberpunk. There's also little things about it that kind of made me think it's like a little bit of a Rift's Light. And I found the rule system to just be like overdoing things in a few ways, especially with the dice mechanics. The if you hit a 6, then you get to roll another 6 and add that, and you can end up stacking up a high number off that you don't really need because the difficulties are like never going to be that high anyway, according to at least what I was reading. And just I don't know, it seemed like it was just a little overly complex, needed to be dialed down a little bit, so I never got into it. But looking at it with 44-year-old eyes, it seems not as bad. But I decided to check out Shadowrun Anarchy, the quote-unquote newer version, if you can call it that, considering that this came out, right around the same time that D&D 5e came out. It is the Catalyst version. The rule system is, you can definitely see the direct lineage from the original first edition rules. It shares a lot of features in common. They're definitely the same game, but the newer what they call alternate rule set streamlines it a little bit, chops off a few little things of dead weight, and makes the dice mechanics run smoother. More like a classic die pool where you've got to roll over a target number. Generally, you get a pool of 6-sided dice, and everything that hits a 5 or a 6 counts as a success. And if you roll a bunch of ones, you get a botch. That kind of a thing. It does do a few things that's kind of almost reminiscent of Modifius in terms of trying to build a little bit more role-playing kind of stuff directly into the character creation and having it featured on your character sheet. Its equipment is very free-form, and so I'm sure there's at least one or two people out there in the audience who are not going to like that about it. Its portrayal of cybernetics, high-tech weaponry, all that kind of stuff, cyberdecks. It's all kind of more moldable to a specific character concept, where you have some like wiggle room in exactly how you want your equipment to work, as opposed to having a bunch of real specified items with specified features that come off them. It's a great time-saving device if you're a writer, because goddamn equipment sections suck compared to a lot of other things that you have to put in every last game that counts as a core rulebook. But it sidesteps that mostly. It gives you the basic gist of the setting. Not really that much less information than what you get out of the older books, but as is often the case with newer versions of old things, they're not quite as thick with lore. They're not trying to explain things quite as much. I feel, though, that Anarchy is probably by modern standards, the better game system to use. You could just port things over from the older versions to enrich the setting, or to nail down more specific items of equipment. You would just have to kind of slightly maybe change how damage is generated and stuff. This version seems to be doing much more of something closer to what I do with my rule system, whereas the weapons just have a fixed amount of damage that they do. They do something very different, though, with hit points you get multiple tracks. You get like a stun and a physical health kind of hit point thing going on, and armor, and it's basically still just D&D and cyberpunk. One thing I noticed from reading it is that they call their internet the Matrix, and so that got me thinking again of something I hadn't thought of in a while, and is wondering at one point after the first Matrix movie came out, is like, were the Wachowski siblings into role-playing games before they got into making movies? Because when I was watching that movie, I really felt like I was watching a movie about virtual adepts versus the technocracy in Mage the Ascension. and now like the Matrix was something from a role playing game. I mean, obviously, like that probably just convergent evolution in terms of how they both arrived at using that term to describe this thing. It's not like either invented the term the Matrix, but still, just a interesting little side note, I guess. The newer version, you can either build a character up from scratch. Still has the same classic fantasy races in the game: the metahumans, elves, orcs, dwarves, trolls. Actually, it's shockingly biologically essentialist because it still gives you positive and negative ability score modifiers. Shame on you, Catalyst. Shame. But, for people who miss that kind of stuff or appreciate the fact that things that the players are doing during character creation are actually having an effect on game outcomes down the line so that their choices matter, that's great. Doesn't really give you much like the original Shadowrun. There's not much in the way of like specific character occupation art, types. There's no classes in there. It's more you just kind of build your own character out of what kind of skills and all that kind of stuff you want to give to them. However, like the original Shadowrun, it does give you a fuck ton of pre-made archetypes that you can just, grab and throw into a game. Unlike first edition, though, these give you specific character names and backstories for them. So you'd have to, modify a few little things on them if you wanted to use any of the pre-stock characters. Whereas the templates in first edition were more generically formatted. And, I don't know, in terms of flavor text, I might say that actually that's the thing that Shadowrun First Edition still has an edge over the Catalyst Anarchy version, is that the archetypes seem more interesting. Like some of these are just either copying the old archetypes anyway, or adding new things like, seriously, there's a dwarf parkour lady as an archetype, because that's what you want to play in your Shadowrun Cyberpunk game, is a dwarf girl who's really good at doing parkour. I don't know. We live in the world we live in now, don't we? Say no more than that. Other than that, it's still the same setting it's always been. I don't know how much in depth really need to be about it. On the surface, it's really easy to pitch to players. You're playing, D&D races, but in a cyberpunk setting. It's not really all terribly post-apocalyptic. Magic is present, so you can have both, high-tech technomancers and actual magic users, or people who just, use cybernetics, or people who just rely on skill and moxie and all that kind of stuff. It seems like a fairly solid game if that's your thing. Some of the depictions of the setting are they're interesting choices, but stuff that's fairly reminiscent of other cyberpunk games, in terms of projections of America's future and all that kind of stuff. Instead of being quite as Cyberpunk 2020 occasionally maybe gets confused of kind of having a bit of a Japanese fetishism in it. The Shadowrun is more Native American fetishism in the same way, and less of the Asian influence. They depict what is already a massively alternate timeline from the one we're on, where a good chunk of the Western American states are back under the control of various First Nations tribes, and that kind of stuff. There's a confederacy again. Interesting choices. I'm not really sure if this book was coming out right now, if some of the stuff in here would really pass muster in scrutiny with certain factions within the gaming community or not. But I guess it's been overlooked. I can't say that I've seen a large amount of source books out there for it. It's got a few, but it hasn't been supported to nearly the same degree that Dungeons & Dragons has, obviously. I wish I had a copy of the original FASA version of MechWarrior, because I can't compare those two. But the rule system from MechWarrior Destiny, which came out in 2020, is very, very similar to this. Not quite identical, but nearly identical, and it uses the same overall rules mechanics. If I have anything that probably is like the biggest complaint of both this and MechWarrior, is that they both try to do that pretentious thing of like mild co-DMing where the players can narrate their own stuff and introduce scenes and new NPCs and all that kind of stuff. I'm not hip to that, but that's a personal thing. If you're into such, feel free. They do have ways for you to use the narration points that players could use for narrations that they control. If you don't want to have that kind of mild co-DMing thing going on, there's still ways to use the narration points in a way that's not just like it's not the same as having the advantage die, or in 5th edition D&D, but I don't know. They do echo each other. Like I said, that's one of those things that actually reminds me more of the kind of stuff that you see in Modifius games like Star Trek Adventures. So, overall, do I recommend it? Having never played either version of it, sure. It seems perfectly functional. It's the simplicity of its setting. It does work in its favor for people who maybe are new to cyberpunk. You just kind of just get them lodged in the idea that there's some mutations that caused a bunch of humans to become metahumans. And you don't have to necessarily just have to lean so heavily on giving them all this, biographical social science data on how society has evolved over the next, 50 years and all that kind of stuff. Weirdly, it is set now in the year 2078, which is odd considering that Cyberpunk also jumped up to 2077. But I think the releasing, I don't have a copy of Cyberpunk Red, but I'm pretty sure this came out before Cyberpunk Red, so it's just odd that they both jumped ahead to almost the exact same year in the future. So there's been a few additions to the timeline, but it doesn't seem to have gone back and revised anything out of the older version of Shadowrun. It's supposedly still pretty compatible, with this one. So I guess that's about it. What more do you need to know? I guess you could tell me below in the comments what more you need to know, and I could maybe make another video on it if I feel like there's enough meat on these bones. So until then, stay waspinated.